It's always interesting getting the outside perspective, isn't it? So, I got through another book. I got commissioned for. Okay, technically, I was commissioned for a novella. I think is would be what it would be considered. Um, but this is another entry in Iain M. Banks's Culture series. This one being State of the Art. Sorry, The State of the Art. So this is a collection of short stories, most of them quite short indeed, but with the bulk of it taken up with the titular story of The State of the Art. Now, while I was technically only commissioned to read that particular story, because I had fairly lengthy flights to and from California, I ended up reading the whole thing. So I'm not going to dwell on the other stories. I thought they were interesting. They were of appropriate length, which is always something. It's one of the things I actually really appreciate about short form fiction is that it never feels over detailed or stretched out. It's often like exactly as long as it needs to be to make the point that it's making, and I that's something that I feel is underappreciated when it leans on the short end. We tend to, as audiences, there's a slight tangent, I know that. We tend as audiences to like, it should be as long as it needs to be. And that, I feel that is so frequently used to justify things being too freaking long, especially movies lately. I miss hour and a half movies a lot. But like, especially with something like fiction, we have this notion that like, if you let the writer write for as long as they need to, you end up with 500 page books. You know, some stories just need 20 pages. And I feel like short story collections like this are something that more writers in general would benefit from doing. Because I think there's probably a lot of ideas that either get abandoned because they can't be expanded out into a full thing, or get crammed haphazardly into a longer piece of work, because I just feel like short fiction is something it used to be the beating heart, especially of sci-fi, because so much of sci-fi was put out as sections in magazines, and that's just not the case anymore. So something like this feels a bit like a lost art form. And I mean, I say that appropriately enough. Original publication 1991, so you know this is actually of a different era altogether, but it's an era I'm somewhat nostalgic for. Like I said, I'm not really going to go through the stories that I wasn't commissioned for. I will say that they were good. Odd Attachment actually like gave me the shivers in like that kind of like kind of unsettling way that Banks also managed to do with certain parts of Surface Detail. That was the one. Took me a second to think of it. You probably had a jump cut. But you know, certain aspects of that really unsettled me. And Odd Attachment is like a very simplistic way of getting a very similar response out of me. Like, okay, when this guy wanted to be unsettling, he was actually quite good at it. Some of the short stories I liked more than others, but I didn't think any of them were bad. Now, as for the one I was actually commissioned to take a look at, The State of the Art, that is very much a culture story. The others, some of them are, or at least could be, and others like unlikely, possibly, but like there's no reason for it to be. This like very much is, and this is a story of the culture observing Earth, which brought up the first thing, which challenged an assumption that I'd been making, which is that the culture is not from Earth. I can't remember if anybody ever clarified this in comments on my other reviews. They probably did, and I just didn't remember. But I'd always made the assumption that the culture was the far-flung future of humanity as it is from Earth. I think part of the reason that I don't think that was a wild assumption for me to make is that the culture citizens, by and large, do tend to be referred to as human. I guess at this point it's more of a sort of a pan-human experience, especially given all the modifications that are called possible within the culture, which is a whole other thing. But like, if they are a solidified entity, Like they have their stuff worked out. They can gland, they can alter their physiology. We get references to contact, to special circumstances, all these things that are staples of the world of the culture. And and they're observing, and it wasn't even contemporaneous to when the book came out. They're observing Earth in 1977, I think, late 70s. And that means that the culture predates Earth, and like our civilization, which is something I just never realized before. It doesn't drastically alter my perception because, again, even beyond just the raw physiology involved, I think that denoting the citizens as human like very much speaks to the way they tend to behave. Banks will write alien creatures as behaving more alien, but he's always written the core of the citizenry of the culture as being very human for the most part, with some alterations to account for the way that technology worked and what they would have grown up with as their normal. But I think that still is at the base level of how he approaches them. And that's even true here as we have them observing Earth. And so, as I said, this is that kind of outsider perspective. And I like the choice to have it set in the 70s, which, I mean, who knows when the heck he originally wrote the thing before it was collected into this. But given the way that it's written, I tend to think that even at the time, he probably was writing further into the past than when he was writing it, which I think is a good way to approach something like that. So you're not necessarily espousing about what's going on right now, but you can instead look at what would have been a point in time that not all, but a decent chunk of the audience, at least at the time that it was released, would have been aware of, if not alive for. So it feels close enough that I can still kind of comment on Earth as it is now without getting bogged down in a ton of specifics of the here and now, which, like, a slight shift like that gives it a little bit more of a timeless feel. And you have this collection of people sort of sent down to Earth. We have our main character, who's also the POV. It's written in the first person, and I don't know if any of the other culture books are. The ones I have read definitely are not. So that was also interesting as well, is that it's all filtered through her perspective, even like her interactions with the ship, the Arbitrary, which I like the ships in the culture series. I like them a lot. A fair amount of my favorite characters are the ships, to be completely honest. And I like the Arbitrary. It has a good sense of humor, which more spaceships should have a good sense of humor. But she gets sent down initially to London, and then for a time she lives in Paris and in Berlin. And this was when the Berlin Wall was still up and the Cold War was still on. And, seeing all these things that humanity can do and can build and can have, that's like, this is nice, but also look at what it does to itself, what it does to the others of its own kind. And it's interesting because most of the characters have not an incredibly different perspective on humanity, but it's different enough that they clash. So by and large, they do all, or the vast majority of them do seem to think humanity is not great. Like, there's some big problems here. And you have your main perspective character. Names in the culture books are tricky for me. They're tricky for me to remember, and they're also tricky for me to say. I know that I think it's her last name that she gets called by is Sma. So with Sma, she definitely sees like they could be better, but the ultimate question that the Arbitrary and these members of the culture being out among humanity are intended to answer is, do we make contact with Earth? Because they are there on behalf of contact. So I'm not doing a ton of explaining like the world building, because at this point I've talked about the culture books often enough. I guess maybe check out some of my earlier reviews where I'll dig into like the ins and outs of that a little bit more. I'm taking some stuff as given that, contact is what it is. It's the organization designed around making contact with species, deciding the best way to go about it, or if they should at all. Special circumstances basically the CIA. They do all the dirty work that is needed to keep everything up and running that nobody really likes to think about the fact that that needs to be done to keep everything up and running. Special circumstances is brought up. It doesn't really enter into this. This is basically a story about contact. And she believes that the culture should make contact with Earth basically to save it from itself. She doesn't trust humanity not to wipe itself out without the hand of something like the culture coming in and going like, frickin' stop for a second. Would you please? So there's that aspect of it. There's the ship, which is kind of seems to have a number of different options, but tends to lean in favor of we leave it alone basically as a control world. Like there's a lot that's unique about this. There's a lot that's not great about this place, mainly the people. But this is something that may be the best that we will get out of it in terms of information for how we proceed in future is to let whatever happens without us touching it. And then there's Lee. Oh, God, Lee. Lee's such a dipshit. Lee is this guy who is never let down onto Earth proper. But he is observing, and the ship is able to, gather film and television and music and makes all that available to the members who stay on the ship and don't actually go down. And Lee is like becomes a massive Star Trek fan, but doesn't absorb any of the notion of like the goodness of humanity that is inherent to Star Trek. He just pictures himself as Captain Kirk and thinks that we should wipe these barbarians out. Like I said, guy's a dipshit. And kind of an amusing one, especially through the lens of Sma, who, like, she knows what a absolute dingbat this guy is. Which I think is a good way to present a character like that. I think the having the lens of somebody who basically just mentally rolling her eyes at him pretty much the whole time helps a character like that go down a little bit better. I might have found him borderline insufferable in a third person omniscient narrative kind of presentation, but filtering it through Sma's view of him helped. It helped a fair bit. And then there's Linter, who basically kind of goes native. He gets down there and he sees this sort of romanticized purity, absent all of the technology, the ability to change the sort of sterilization of the culture. Because while the culture is certainly capable of being decadent because it can indulge in almost all the whims that its citizens might have, it also does that in a very controlled environment. And they pretty much have whatever they want at their fingertips at any time. And Linter kind of sees this, prelapsarian purity to humans. Like, yes, they're kind of brutal. They're kind of a mess. But, like, isn't it a beautiful mess? And again, this is a character that I think I might have found borderline insufferable were it not for the perspective of Sma, who basically looks at him and goes, what is wrong with you? And while she does have some empathy to his perspective, she never is fully won over by it, which I appreciate, because I think there's just kind of a shallowness. Actually, I'd say there's almost an equal shallowness to Linter's view of humanity as there is to Lee's, just in different directions. Linter with this over-romanticized notion of, like the spacefaring culture equivalent of, living off the land, getting back to basics, getting rid of this modern technology. That's what's life all about. We don't appreciate what life is really like anymore, which, like, hey, if that helps you out and make you happier with your life, fine, I guess. But that strikes me in most cases to be a pretty shallow take by somebody who probably just wasn't happy with the life that they had and is just looking for anything. And in the case of someone like Lee, like, his take is really shallow because he just sees humanity as not worth keeping around him. Well, let's just get rid of them. That's a very shallow take as well. And just one that's significantly more violent. But it's interesting because Linter basically comes to the same conclusion as the ship for completely different reasons. The ship believes that it's best to not get involved or make contact so that we can just see what happens, whereas Linter believes in like maintaining the purity of people, which, again, it really does help. Like, honestly, Sma's perspective is a big part of why this works, especially for me, as someone who tends to get very eye-rolly whenever I was going to say non-human, I guess in this case, non-Earth based civilization, like, romanticizes Earth humanity. Like, it ticks me off when Doctor Who does it. David Tennant's 10th Doctor did it more than a little. And in general, you get it with other things like, oh, here's the beautiful thing about humanity. Like, look, I'm not saying we have nothing going for us, but overall, we kind of suck. Like, look out your window. Sucks, don't it? Yeah, that's us. So I appreciate if you're gonna have somebody have this perspective of like, oh, this wonderful purity of their existence, to have it filtered through the lens of a character who doesn't really agree with that, but also is not fully dismissive of it, because Sma is a very fully rounded character. Not to say that Linter isn't. I'm not sure Lee is, but also he doesn't need to be. Linter has some dimension to him, but I think by far the most fully rounded character is Sma, and I think filtering everything through the perspective of the most nuanced and rounded character helps these aspects that under other circumstances might have genuinely bugged me instead make me appreciate them, because I don't have to just take them at face value. I think that's something I'm coming to appreciate as I get older, and I recognize more and more what tropes drive me up the wall I just don't like. It is interesting for me to find occasions where, like, okay, but that's kind of that thing that I don't like. Why does it work for me here? And to realize in many cases, it's not that the trope is inherently bad. It's just that I need it presented in a more nuanced or delicate way than usually happens when the trope is invoked. So something like this with Linter, like falling in love with humanity, I've seen that so many freaking times, and I'm sick of it, but I wasn't sick of it here because while that perspective is present, it's not the one that I am being pushed to agree with and being spoon-fed as this is correct. I think the narrative is presented in a way that if I chose to feel that that was correct, I could. I don't. And so I appreciate not feeling like that was being pushed at me. Kind of similarly with how going through Babylon 5, if you don't listen to the podcast I do with Jesse Gender, there's a link in the description for that. Going through Babylon 5 and just realizing that as much as I rail against romantic subplots, it's ultimately not romance that I have a problem with. It's courting. I hate the way most Hollywood and mainstream entertainment does courting and the early parts of a relationship. I actually really love an established dynamic between characters. That's usually the best relationship stuff. But so much emphasis is always on like, oh, the early awkward days. I'm like, I don't want to see this. I don't find it entertaining. And it's often real boring and kind of cringe. So minor tangent, but just using to illustrate the point that I think, I mean, like all of Banks' stuff, guy was a real good writer. Like all of Banks' stuff, I enjoyed this, and I like the way it's presented and the depths of the ideas, even as it doesn't get so heady as to be alienating. Like it keeps its feet grounded enough in people, ultimately in people, whether they are human or culture. You know, he keeps that grounding even as he deals in some out there and more heady sci-fi, and that's how you got to do this kind of stuff. Man was real good at it. So the state of the art, I liked it. I've liked all these. Not sure I'm in a perspective to rank them. I think I still like Accession the best. Surface Detail was real good. This might be just above Surface Detail. It's either just above or just below. They're real close. Player of Games is probably the one I like the least, although then again, that is the one I took in first and probably at that point had the least appreciation for what it was doing. I might like it more if I were to reread it. I don't have time to do that, but I'm just saying. In any case, have you read this? What did you think about it? Have you read the other short stories in it? What did you think about them? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments and let's talk about it. Patreon pays the bills and is how I was commissioned to read this book. But you can also support me for lower tiers than the commission rate. But any amount you can help me out with is greatly appreciated, and you do get perks for it, but don't worry too much about it. Like, share, subscribe, help me out as well. But what I really want you to remember is you don't need to worry too much about that because we take a relaxed attitude around here. Just come on back next time you need a break. And now to thank my highest supporting patrons: Robin Moore, Zuma Lutfula, Goddess Elida, Trista Ashley, Oliver B., Melissa Peterson, Tarak, The Thing That Goes Going to Iain M, Jean Foray, Movie Turtle, Ulrich Bogdan, Loki Eris, Linda Walters, Jen, Auntie Kate 808, Becky Sparks, Fernambilax the Poodle, Tracy Scrabbit, Angry Casperol, Dave Hall, White Bearish, Rosalind Bennett, Pal Barabajagal, Lucy Wood, Dorm Mayhew, and Mira G. Thank you for your support, and consider supporting me as well on Patreon.